So we didn't associate ourselves with basketball. It was just never a popular sport until Vince Carter came along, until Steve Nash came along, both of them in the early 2000s. And I think that just, it turned a lot of Canadians onto the sport in terms of something to watch, something to start practicing, to start reading about, to start learning about. And of course, it also made a lot of people start to play. And, when you have an inspiration like that and you see them at kind of the highest levels of the sport doing things that look really cool on TV, I think a lot of kids wanted to be that. So yeah, Vince definitely resonated with the population because he was must-watch TV. Even though the Raptors weren't necessarily the best team in the league, most NBA fans wanted to tune into Raptors games at that time because every game he was doing something incredible athletically. Like he was just such a fun player to watch, and that's why he led the NBA in MVP in all-star votes, that season. It was just that he was box office. And so, yeah, it made the Raptors cool, like I said, and it made being a fan of the Raptors a really cool thing.
He is the author of The Golden Generation: How Canada Became a Basketball Powerhouse, which is available now. We have the pleasure in welcoming Oren Weisfeld onto Hoopsology. Welcome to the show.
Hello, hello. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Truly appreciate it. With our authors, before we jump into the book, we have a bit of a tradition on our show. We cover basketball culture, what makes the game of basketball so great. So take this question any way you want it. What is your first or favorite basketball memory?
I guess my favorite, and it's relevant to the book, is probably when Canada beat Spain at the 2023 World Cup of basketball. It clinched their first Olympic berth in 24 years. So for Canada, it was a long time coming. A lot of struggles went into it, and that game against Spain, the number one team at the world at the time, was just such a good one. And Canada came from behind. SGA led them there, and they beat Spain. They got the kind of demon off their back, and I just remember watching that game and being super emotional. In part because it was a long time coming for Canada as a fan, and also in part because that was kind of the genesis of the book I wrote.
Yeah, so talk about that in terms of the origin process, putting the book together, and it's chronicalizing the history of Canada, becoming one of the major forces in international basketball. Just when I was growing up, I would say Canada, not too relevant. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong in terms of international play in the 90s, but now that's certainly changed. So can you kind of go over just your research, just how you compiled just the information for this book to tell this narrative?
Yeah, Canada internationally, actually, like you're right, but they had a lot of success in the 70s and 80s internationally. They got to every Olympics, every World Championship behind a coach named Jack Donahue, and they placed fourth at the Olympics a couple times. They had great players, Leo Rautins, Jay Triano. But there was a huge gap there between, in the 90s they struggled, then they got back to the Olympics in the 2000s, and then 24 years again they struggled. Even while they were producing NBA players, struggled to get back to the Olympics to do anything internationally. So that was kind of the main area I wanted to highlight in my book, like what went wrong, why did things take so long with the national team, and at the same time, how come at the grassroots level, Canada was being so successful, producing so many great NBA players, great coaches, all this stuff. And yeah,
So I want to touch on just pivotal moments within just the history of basketball within Canada. And I think what comes to mind talking to other journalists, based in that country is the creation of the Toronto Raptors. And the Vancouver Grizzlies at the time. Can you just talk about that in terms of when the NBA first expanded into Canada and just the evolution of the Toronto Raptors, especially with Vince Carter, and then the country losing the Grizzlies to Memphis now. Can you kind of just discuss that in terms of how pivotal the NBA investing into Canada really was in terms of the growth of the sport there?
for sure. I mean, it is the genesis of all this in terms of the inspiration at the very least. Like growing up in the 70s and 80s, guys could watch a fuzzy NBA game every week or so on TV, but they had to really like hop over to Buffalo and stuff like that if they wanted to really watch the NBA. What happened in '95 when the Raptors and Grizzlies came was it gave Canadian kids, the opportunity to see people who looked like them on an NBA court in their cities, and specifically Vince Carter. When he arrived in Toronto, he turned, a nothing city basketball wise into this, cultural force that everybody knew about, who is the leading MVP vote getter in 2000. And when he put on that show at the slam dunk contest specifically, that was a huge moment for Toronto, wearing the dinosaur jersey. And so many kids, were inspired by him, and just seeing him, and a guy that looked like them, it made them have some sort of belief that, okay, one day I could be playing for the Raptors, I could be in the NBA. There was, unfortunately, I guess, like a whole infrastructure that had to build up in terms of the development side before that became a reality. But the inspiration, the Raptors are definitely a huge credit for.
So, can you elaborate further in terms of just the fan base, right, and their connection to specifically Vince Carter? Even though he went on to play for several other NBA teams, it seems like his connection to the Raptors is just different compared to his other 10 years that he spent in most of his career at.
Hmm.
So, I mean, when people just bring up the Raptors, usually besides the championship, they do bring up Vince Carter in that slam dunk contest. So, can you just talk about that and then kind of link it to, Steve Nash and his success, within the NBA as well, in terms of just cultivating this fandom within the country of Canada?
Yeah, sure. It was all going on at the same time in terms of, I mean, Canada has always been a hockey country, so we didn't associate ourselves with basketball. It was just never a popular sport until Vince Carter came along, until Steve Nash came along, both of them in the early 2000s. And I think that just, it turned a lot of Canadians onto the sport in terms of something to watch, something to start practicing, to start reading about, to start learning about. And um of course, it also made a lot of people start to play. And, when you have an inspiration like that, and you see them at kind of the highest levels of the sport doing things that look really cool on TV, I think a lot of kids wanted to be that. So yeah, Vince definitely resonated with the population because he was must-watch TV. Even though the Raptors weren't necessarily the best team in the league, most NBA fans wanted to tune into Raptors games at that time because every game he was doing something incredible athletically. Like, he was just such a fun player to watch, and that's why he led the NBA in MVP in all-star votes, that season. It was just that he was box office. And so, yeah, it made the Raptors cool, like I said, and it made being a fan of the Raptors a really cool thing. So, yeah, that coupled with Nash leading them to a great run at the Olympics where they beat the former champion Yugoslavia, they beat Australia. Those two things together, a lot of Canadians who are in the NBA today watched that and were inspired.
Can you compare just with different sports in terms of when they make deep runs or win the title, how the community gathers around those teams? Is it very similar, or do you notice a difference? So, the Blue Jays, I hate to bring this up, but a very heartbreaking game 7. And then
Yeah.
you have the Raptors, winning the title. The Maple Leafs, having success recently in the NHL playoffs. Can you guys talk about how the community rallies around those teams? Do you notice any differences, particularly, when the Raptors, when they made that run in 2019 to, the Blue Jays this year? Is it just like one sport's popular than the other, or do you think that the community, when one team's doing well, no matter what the sport is, they're going to rally behind that sport, just depending on how deep their run is in terms of the playoffs?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things it depends on. But Torontonians are huge sports fans. We rally around all our teams. And one thing it depends on is definitely the team and the connection they have to it. And I think that's why this Blue Jays run resonated so much. It's not necessarily that it was baseball, it was the fact that it was such a special team. They got along so well. They kept coming up in big moments. They were just really fun to root for. That Raptors team in 2019 was a little different in that they were underdogs. And similar to the Jays team, though, no one expected them to win, right? Outside a handful of people in Toronto, even up to the finals when they played the vaunted KD Steph Warriors, nobody expected them to win. So we definitely have a bit of that chip on our shoulder mentality. We rally around teams that are underdogs. So I think that's how the Raptors will always be different than the Leafs. The Leafs are always these kind of underachievers who are always meant to win, who are always expected to win, who have the most money in hockey and all that stuff. So it's different in that regard, but Yeah, we definitely rally around all our sports, but basketball, that Raptors title, it came at a time I think when so many people were kind of like gravitating towards the sport away from hockey. That's just been a natural progression of things
Hmm.
due to the cost, due to the inaccessibility, and people are starting to play soccer and basketball more and more in this country. And so yeah, that came at a time when I think it was already starting, and it just pushed so many more people towards the sport.
This might be an unfair question because I want you to peek into the future, maybe like 20 years from now, just based on what you said in terms of soccer and basketball gaining ground. Is there a time, within that time span that possibly basketball overtakes hockey as kind of the number one sport? Is that outlandish to say, or do you think just hockey has too much inroads? Do you think just based on what you said in terms of the inaccessibility and just, SGA, being MVP and just being such a force. I mean, I live in Denver, so I know how good Jamal Murray is. So,
Mhm.
whether you see more players coming out from Canada to Toronto tempo, is there a time where basketball might overtake hockey, or do you think that's impossible?
Oh no, I think it'll happen. I think soccer and basketball will both overtake hockey. You know, like you have to remember Canada is a nation made up of immigrants, and more the population is becoming that, and new Canadians, they are attracted to sports like basketball and soccer. You know, that's the sport that the country they came from often plays, and it's also more accessible, and it's also more just like easy and comfortable to play than a sport like hockey, which has a lot of issues with it within the culture that are obviously coming to light. So yeah, I think it's only a matter of time before those sports pass hockey, and it is going to take a moment, you know, especially if basketball is going to pass soccer. You know, it's going to take a moment like the Raptors winning again, or the tempo, or Canada, you know, winning a gold medal at the Olympics in 2028 in USA. You know, like those, that's the kind of thing that has the potential to really ignite the country around it.
And with the players, you mentioned that, like with the fans, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that the kid is a chip on their shoulder in terms of how they feel about their teams. Do the players share that same mentality? So, for instance, SGA, Jamal Murray, RJ Barrett, do they
Yeah.
share that kind of same just mental framework in terms of when they're entering, the United States basketball culture? The USA, I think, is very arrogant when it comes to just basketball and on the global scene specifically. So, and I'm sure with a lot of these, prominent Canadian basketball players, that they're facing, a lot of just, I would say, just ignorance and probably prejudice just based on where they come from, when they're first, before they actually see their game. So, do you think they have the underdog chip on their shoulder when just entering kind of this framework of specifically the United States and the NBA itself?
Yeah, no, for sure. These guys, like a lot of them in the book, talk to me about how for them a big part of their motivation is to kind of put Canada on that map, is to prove that Canada belongs with the USA, with Serbia, with France at the top of the basketball rankings. And this generation of Canadians is really the first to go en masse to the NBA. And when they tried to do that, you know, whether it was AAU, whether it was the NCAA, like there came with a bit of a reputation when Canadians started going over there. Oh, Canadians are soft, they don't play defense, similar to the reputation Europeans had in the NBA. And these guys had to kind of prove that wrong. So when they went to tournaments in the United States, or when they went to start playing NCAA basketball, in their college years, they had that mentality that they had to prove, yeah, like you said, maybe ignorant Americans wrong, and they had to prove the Canadians could be better basketball players than even Americans were, and all that stuff. So I think that is why you see like a Dillon Brooks having such a chip on his shoulder, a Luguentz Dort having that chip on his shoulder. The way they play, the way they force themselves into the league is very much this kind of identity of like I'll do anything I have to do to get here. I might not be the most skilled or the biggest guy, but like I will figure out a way to get here. And yeah, part of that comes with the identity that they kind of grew up with, just being these underdogs.
You mentioned on your social media feed an excerpt from your book with SGA saying that he's very, very competitive and that when it comes to competition, there is no friends and that there is no family. Now, I'm not super old, but I think, growing up watching basketball in the 90s, that's very like common, just in terms of, no friends, no family, just kind of, really high competitiveness on the court compared to now in terms of a lot of players, very buddy. They know each other since grade school. They play AAU, college, just international, all these tournaments, these bonds form because they are playing with each other before they get into the NBA most commonly. So is that different in terms of the basketball culture within Canada, kind of that old school vibe of like, hey, this guy's on the opposing team, like, maybe in the off season we can grab a beer or whatever, but during the season, you're like, this guy is my enemy here. We're playing against him. We're trying to win. Like there is no friends. I just feel like maybe there's a very different basketball culture with Canada. I'm just curious with SGA's mentality, do a lot of his contemporaries share that same framework, or is that just exclusive to SGA in terms of how he thinks?
No, I think like most guys who make it to the NBA, to be honest, are incredibly competitive, and that's part of the reason they get there. So I think like SGA was a little bit different, and that quote comes specifically from like Nikhil Alexander Walker, his cousin who he grew up with, and just the fact that like the way that Shea used to come at him, it surprised him because he never thought, I would come to blows with my family, but Shea didn't really care when they were between those lines. It was just he was going to do anything he had to do to win. It didn't really matter that it was his cousin on the other side of it. So I think that's where that came from. But yeah, like Dillon Brooks, RJ Barrett, Luguentz Dort, these guys are all like incredible competitors. And I think that's a big part of the reason that they got to the NBA in the first place. And I think a lot of the Americans too. Like it's true that they can be buddy buddy on the sidelines and after the games, but I think in between those lines, like guys play incredibly hard these days and they're super competitive. And yeah, yeah.
Curious, what is the basketball coverage from a media standpoint within Canada? We talked about in terms of the sports, in terms of their growth, and you're projecting that soccer and basketball will overtake hockey. But from a media standpoint, has that infrastructure caught on in terms of creating more institutions covering the sport of basketball? Have you noticed, an evolution in terms of coverage on the game compared to America? You kind of speak to just the media landscape in terms of covering basketball itself.
Yeah, unfortunately, the media landscape in general in Canada is dying off, and publications keep shutting down or firing people. So, yeah, I would love to say that it's catching up, but part of it is a lack of imagination at the people at the top, and then part of it is just a lack of resources. So, no, I think if anything, hockey continues to dominate because it is still the safe thing, and these corporations just keep getting smaller and smaller in terms of their coverage. And yeah, so people mostly are doing it kind of on the side or independently. Like I'm a freelancer, and my friend Lee Van Osman just created the Canadian Basketball Show, which is a podcast. And so a lot of people are doing it independently on Substacks, on blogs, and that sort of stuff. And that's where you really find some of the best basketball coverage.
That's very interesting because I'm sure with the tempo, and maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but this is based on the recent expansion teams, especially with the Valkyries, and especially since, Canada's getting their first WNBA team and just the attendance. I'm sure they're going to be very successful, even if they don't have a star player. I just think there's strong evidence in terms of them coming out of the gate being very, very successful from an attendance standpoint. So do you think the fans will just demand just more coverage? Like, I just find that interesting. Do you think they're just going to remain just stubborn if there's even a demand that there's a source of making money providing coverage for these rising sports that's proven to provide, a source of income? I'm just very curious. Whether the stubbornness just went out in terms of this always covering hockey, even though if the Raptors continue to be successful, all these benchmarks that you mentioned earlier do happen, do you think they'll still remain stubborn in terms of their media coverage?
It's a good question. It's something I've thought about. I mean, like the tempo will get a good amount of coverage for sure, but how that coverage will come is a question because most likely I think what'll happen is the Raptors writers who are already hired full time to do that will probably get the summer job now to go cover the tempo. In addition to covering Canada basketball, which has always kind of been the thing, rather than necessarily publications hiring new people who specialize in women's basketball to do that as a full time job, which I think should be the case, right? And you should have people doing it full year, covering college basketball in the other in when the WNBA is not playing, doing the draft, all this sorts of stuff. But I would be very surprised if that investment comes right away.
Were there any chapters within your book that were difficult or surprised you in terms of like a framework, and then when writing it, it turned out differently that's based on your research?
Oh, well, like there were definitely ones that I had to cut, which comes to mind. Like I had a chapter on the rise of Quebec basketball, and there's so many players coming out of Quebec now, like Benedict Mathurin and Omax Prosper and Chris Boucher, and I wanted to kind of explain that history, but it ended up not really fitting with the narrative, and it ended up getting cut. But in terms of the chapters that came out differently, I'm sure there's a lot of examples. I just can't really put my mind on one because they were constantly evolving. Um, yeah, but maybe I'll come back to that one.
And I just want to get your feelings of expansion. Well, I ask a lot of journalists this, and I find their responses very interesting in terms of it seems like the NBA, instead of expanding within North America, they're seeking Europe. And I'm
Mhm.
just wondering, just based on just the rise of popularity of basketball within Canada, do you think that is a mistake in terms of not just seeking more teams within Canada itself in terms of that international expansion?
Yeah, I think Montreal needs a team. I just talked about Quebec. I think Montreal is a great basketball market. It's becoming a real big city, and yeah, like they're producing all these pro players, so eventually they could have a local on the team. And I just really am confident that they would show up for a team, and they have the infrastructure there, they have the stadium, they have it all. And they never got a chance. I mean, Vancouver got a chance, and obviously things would probably be very different now. And I think, but I don't see the same culture in BC that I see in Montreal. So yeah, I think that would be a great option for the NBA to consider.
Has there been any inroads that you have found in terms of just another team within Canada? Do you know why the NBA is hesitant? Obviously, with the WNBA, they put a team there. Do you know why there's hesitancy in terms of, because we usually hear about NBA expansion is Vegas and Seattle. Really,
Yeah.
Canada's not mentioned those discussions, which is adding another team in the countries. Just curious,
Yeah.
why have you come across that research in terms of why the NBA has been so hesitant on that?
No, I just think it's because mostly like those two cities you just mentioned are so safe, right?
Yeah.
Like Seattle and Vegas have always been talked about as like cities needing teams and markets where other sports work. So there's probably that history. Like obviously Montreal, they lost the Expos of Major League Baseball, so maybe there's some fear lingering from that, even though it happened a long time ago. But I don't necessarily think the NBA. They're smart and they really love the international angle of this, and so that's why I think there is some hope that Canada gets a second NBA team. And the Tempo, for example, play two regular season games in Montreal their inaugural season. So these leagues are smart. They know that pushing the game throughout the entire continent, the entire world is the best way forward. Mexico City needs a team one day. That would be great, I think. So I hope they just continue expanding in those directions.
Yeah, I agree with you. Pointing to SGA, especially with the Thunder winning the title, can you tell about his popularity and particularly within Canada and ranking him other sports stars? Where does he rank? How do you just common sports fans feel about SGA compared to America? Kind of your vibe in terms of his this superstar status within Canada.
Yeah, he's one of the most famous athletes in Canada, undoubtedly. I think it's probably like Connor McDavid ahead of him still. Hockey does still have that appeal within the more rural regions especially, but I have to think that Shea would be second. He's definitely bigger than any of the footballers and most of the other hockey players. So yeah, if you go into gyms, like I'm biased because I'm a basketball guy and I go to a lot of gyms and stuff, and like he's easily the most famous basketball player. All these kids want to be him. We got to uh host a bunch of like watch parties at the Olympics and with kids especially, and they love him so much. They love everything about him. They want to be him. His jersey is one of the most popular in Canada. And yeah, but also guys like Andrew Wiggins and Jamal Murray and RJ Barrett, these guys are also incredibly popular. So It's hard to exactly rank him, but I would honestly probably put him second in just like the general sports fandom.
When readers finish your book, what are some of the lasting impressions that you want them to have, especially if they have no knowledge of how popular the sport of basketball is in Canada and just like its roots and evolution to the game at large?
Yeah, I think probably similar to what happened to America, the genesis of basketball in Canada really started at the grassroots level. Like it wasn't corporations and it wasn't the government like USA Basketball or Canada Basketball. It was really people working in communities, working in gyms at the grassroots level and just dedicating their time to these kids and figuring out different ways to help them develop and help them get exposure to the next level. So that's definitely a takeaway I want people to have is to realize like who the real change makers were and who how they often did that work in spite of the government or the corporations.
Oren, thank you very much for your time. Truly appreciate it. Can you let our audience know where they can find you on social media, any upcoming projects, or where they can find your work as well?
Yeah, here's the book, The Golden Generation. You can buy it at wherever you buy books. It's only 19 bucks American, so pretty cheap holiday gift. And you can find me on social media at Oren Weisfeld, writing a story now, like I said, about Quebec and about kind of that history of Quebec basketball. But I also cover a lot of like normal, regular NBA stuff outside of Canadian basketball as well. So yeah, you can look out for my work on Twitter.
Before I let you go, anything catching your eye this season? High ratings for the season so far. A lot of surprise team, really good play so far. Pretty competitive during the early parts of the regular season. Anything catching your eye, you
Yeah.
think?
Well, you mentioned Jamal Murray, and it looks like he is in the best form he's been in a very long time.
Agreed.
All-star, we could say. And obviously in Canada, we are keeping a close eye on Jamal because we are hopeful that he will rejoin the national team for a run in 2028 alongside Shai, form perhaps the best backcourt in the world finally. So yeah, I'm definitely keeping an eye on Denver and what Jamal's doing and it's interesting because they're gonna match up against Shai and it's gonna be two Canadian point guards atop the Western Conference and it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, it's awesome. Oren, thank you very much for the time. Truly appreciate it. Congratulations on the book.
All right, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.